A warm welcome, everyone. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has suggested there is a realistic possibility the war in Ukraine could continue to the end of next year. Speaking in India, he also said Britain would reopen its embassy in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, next week. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia's recent gains in the east of the country are only temporary and Moscow's forces will be pushed back across the border. A senior Russian military commander has been quoted as saying that Moscow aims to take full control of southern Ukraine as well as the eastern Donbass region. It's not yet clear whether the comments were officially sanctioned. According to the World Bank, physical damage to Ukraine's buildings and infrastructure from Russia's invasion has reached roughly $60 billion. Here's more on the invasion.
Russia's defense ministry said it struck 58 military targets in Ukraine overnight, including sites where troops, fuel depots, and military equipment were concentrated. The ministry said it had also struck 3 targets using high-precision missiles in Ukraine, including an S-300 air defense system and a large concentration of Ukrainian troops with their equipment. Over in Ukraine's southern Black Sea port city of Odessa, many residents have left their homes and are hesitant to move back amidst fears of landing in the city by Russian forces. Early morning in Odessa, Aliana Stepanova, a local resident, heard shelling and took a video of the Black Sea from the window. She said it was such a terrifying morning that she is still scared of it. A shell landed outside of her apartment, leaving a crater on the road and with fragments hitting the windows. In Chernihiv, Ukrainian State Emergency Services released a video showing experts removing Russian bombs from the area and its outskirts as Russia's attack on Ukraine continues. The location of the video was verified through the layout and design of the houses and stadium, which matched street view and satellite photography. Chernihiv, a city with pre-war population of around 290,000, was heavily bombed after Russia invaded Ukraine. In Mariupol, new images of pro-Russian forces were seen on patrol in the Ukrainian port city yesterday as they looked to assert full control after weeks of fighting. Members of the Chechen Special Forces led by Russia's State Duma member Adam Delymkinov were pictured walking near the destroyed administration building of Azovstal Iron and Steel Works, one of the last major strongholds of Ukrainian soldiers in the besieged city. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday that his troops had liberated Mariupol, which will make it the biggest city to fall into Russian hands since the start of what Moscow calls a special military operation. In the meantime, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia had rejected a proposal for a truce, but adds he still harbors hopes for peace. Mr. Zelensky, in a video address, also warned residents in the south of Ukraine to be very careful, as Russian forces might attempt to register them to hold and falsify a so-called referendum on the status of the south of the country. Russia held a referendum to annex Crimean Peninsula in 2014 in a vote that the international community widely regards as illegal.
The United Nations Human Rights is reporting that there is growing evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine, including signs of indiscriminate shelling and summary executions, while it said Ukraine also appeared to have used weapons with indiscriminate effect. The spokeswoman for the Office of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ravina Shamdasani, said while Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, other actions that may amount to war crimes, UN Human Rights monitors in Ukraine have documented what appears to be the use of weapons by Russian armed forces east of the country.
Nearly 2 months ago has plunged Ukraine into a human rights and humanitarian crisis that has devastated the lives of civilians throughout the country and beyond. The UN High Commissioner urges all parties to respect international human rights law and international humanitarian law, in particular the rules governing the conduct of hostilities. Over these 8 weeks, international humanitarian law has not merely been ignored, but seemingly tossed aside. Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, killing civilians and wrecking hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure, actions that may amount to war crimes. We know that the actual numbers are going to be much higher as the horrors inflicted in these areas of intense fighting, such as Mariupol, come to light. The scale of summary executions of civilians in areas previously occupied by Russian forces are also emerging. The preservation of evidence and the decent treatment of mortal remains must be ensured, as well as the psychological and other relief for victims and their relatives.
German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock continued her tour of the Baltic states today, arriving in the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. Baerbock met Lithuanian President at the presidential palace, which was decorated in Ukrainian colors, before traveling on to meet her counterpart at the Foreign Ministry. She has had to address criticism by allies and commentators of Germany's apparent foot-dragging on delivering the weaponry Kyiv says it needs to fend off Russian attacks. After consultations with the Lithuanian foreign minister, the German foreign minister says she is in favor of a new NATO strategy on the eastern flank to defend against a Russian attack and wants Germany to make a substantial contribution to this. Both ministers also said it requires an appropriate deployment of NATO forces on the eastern flank. So far, about 1,500 NATO troops have been stationed in Lithuania, including about 1,000 from Bondswehr. Many analysts in Ukraine urgently say they need heavy weapons to drive back a Russian invasion that has now concentrated east of Donbass region. While Ukraine's light armaments and tactics have had some success in slowing Russia's advance, they say stopping and reversing that incursion will need heavy battlefield weaponry like tanks and howitzers. An expert at a panel discussion hosted by a Russian think tank has accused the United States of taking steps to avoid becoming involved in a direct confrontation with Russia amid the ongoing Ukraine conflict. Andrew Shevchentsov, program director of the Valdai Discussion Club think tank, who specializes in U.S. foreign policy and international conflict, believes that the current conflict between both countries as a result of years of provocation by the US-led NATO. He said it is worth noting that after the start of Russia's special military operation late February, the US and some Western countries have been scaling back their military deployments in Ukraine, although they have continued to supply weapons to the country. Shevchentsov believes the US has been sending clear signals that it is not ready to engage in any direct escalation with Russia. According to him, Russia has no intention of threatening the safety of NATO, nor does it want NATO to challenge its bottom line. And the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that there have been no changes to Russia's timetable for making foreign companies pay for gas in rubles, following Britain's decision to grant Russia's Gazprom bank a license for gas payments until the end of May. According to Mr. Peskov, all the timings for the payments were set out in Putin's presidential decree at the end of March, and settlements should be carried out in line with that order. Earlier this week, Mr. Peskov said there was still time for so-called unfriendly countries to switch to payments for gas in rubles that fall due in May. Russia and Ukraine are major commodities producers, and disruptions have caused global prices to soar, especially for oil and natural gas. Food costs have jumped, with wheat, for which Ukraine and Russia make up 30% of global exports. But what ways can exporters, such as those in the Middle East and Africa, benefit from higher prices? Dr. Ted George, the founder and chief narrative officer of Kleos Advisory UK, he puts all into perspective for us. Dr. George, thank you for joining us on the program.
Good to be back.
The UN says that more than 70% of Africa's economies are at severe risk from this war, this invasion. Talk to us about those risks.
Well, I think the key risk above all is food security, because Russia and Ukraine, they are major suppliers of wheat, sunflower oil, and fertilizer, petroleum products as well. And so we've seen costs shoot up. A lot of supplies of food are not as available as before, and that increases the risk of famine. And of course, there are a lot of the increased costs related to this as well. So palm oil prices, for example, have shot up, even though Russia doesn't export palm oil, because other companies are trying to choose substitutes to the oil that they can't get. We're going to see some of the knock-on effects of the world recession potentially on Africa. There are fears there could be a recession, particularly with the level of inflation that's at. But the truth is, there are also a number of African countries, the commodity exporters, which are experiencing a boom in commodity prices. So there is some upside here.
So, and you know, we heard from the IMF, 41 African countries facing the maximum exposure to at least one emergency caused by that invasion. How much has been felt, would you say, with respect to that commodities markets, and which areas now in Africa?
Well, I think you can say that, commodity prices have gone completely crazy. They were already very high. Food prices were at historical highs before the Russian invasion and went through the roof. And they've only come back a bit since. I mean, still it's the case for most commodities. They're about 50% higher than they were a year ago. And if you take something like wheat, it's still around $1,100 a bushel. That's twice the price it was 2 years ago. So the thing is, there are real concerns there over supplies. And there are more and more countries trying to fight over fewer and fewer supplies out there, and this is what is driving up the prices. And so across the board, everyone is suffering, not just those directly importing from Russia or Ukraine.
So in terms of the impact, what do you think are perhaps the close solutions to this? Yes, most would say an end to the war so things can come back to normal, but that would still take some time, yes?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think the thing is, a lot of it is about, can we stabilize the global markets and stabilize the global supply chain? It was just starting to recover from COVID when the Russia-Ukraine crisis kicked off. But I think a big point to bear in mind here is that, African countries actually depend on a lot of these imports from Russia. Russia wants to keep exporting things like oil and fertilizer and wheat to Africa. So there is a desire to keep these flows going, but there's just a real concern whether, because of international sanctions, they're going to be disrupted.
So in terms of comments about Africa's reaction to Russia's invasion, do you think that Africa stands as more economically driven, perhaps, rather than political?
Well, I think it really depends on where you're talking about. In Africa, there are some countries which are much more pro-Russia and others have been quite muted about the whole thing. I think the point to make is that Africa has no reason to pick a fight with Russia. Russia only accounts for around 1% of Africa's exports, but is a major supplier of wheat, sunflower oil, fertilizer, petroleum products. And if you take a country, for example, like Senegal, they're exposed across all of those different commodities from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So I think the fact is that Russia definitely wants to keep exporting to Africa. It's not under any specific sanctions in that sense. It just can't export to the USA or the European Union. But the trouble is, you may have the willingness of the Russians to continue exporting and the desire from Africa. But if Russian cargoes can't get international insurance, because insurers are unsure if they can actually get involved with Russian companies, we could see the supply disrupted. So I think the thing is that
so in terms of policy
space
now, to counter the effects of the shock, what would you say countries should start doing?
Well, I think the thing is, look, in terms of mitigating risks, one thing is, much more emphasis on local food supply. There are a lot of foods which grow much more naturally and easily in Africa. Why are we depending on imported wheat, which is expensive as well? There needs to be much better things like irrigation, but that's not always an option in drought-resistant areas as well. But I think of things like, much better environmental practices, stopping deforestation and the degradation of soil. That is directly leading to the change in rains, which is leading, for example, to drought conditions in Somalia. They haven't had rain there for nearly 3 years now, on the edge of a famine. So some of this is short-term and long-term, but essentially a lot of it comes down to much better environmental practices, because the destruction of habitats is directly feeding climate change, which is leading to destruction of habitats. We're getting into a terrible loop here. It's only human activity that can stop this.
Let's talk about fertilizer and food. I mean, you mentioned that they have indeed risen sharply, given that, Russia and Ukraine are food baskets thus far. But there's also been a sort of crisis in terms of food in parts of Africa. How do you think that, the situation there is holding up with regards to this invasion?
Well, I think what we're seeing is essentially there's been such an impact here. The fact we haven't seen rains across certain parts of Africa as well, that I think we're going to, a lot of countries have tried to respond with controls over prices. We've seen a lot of efforts to secure supplies of wheat from other countries. But I think one of the big problems that we have here is the big exporting countries like Australia, North America, Argentina, they are starting to put limitations on their exports as well because they don't want local prices to kick off. So I think it's a very difficult situation in terms of the measures that companies can take, but it does depend where you are in Africa. If you're in Southern Africa now, they just had one of the best maize harvests in history, so they're okay, but it's other areas where there's a lot more concern.
Talk to us about the Middle East and perhaps other parts of the world and how this invasion really affects them.
Well, we've seen, look, one of the upsides, of course, is to do with the increase in oil and gas prices. So you can imagine any of the hydrocarbon exporters there, it's given them a real kind of fiscal boost, but it's also driven up inflation. And a lot of these countries also are dependent on imports of things like food and raw materials from the international market. They've all shot up in price. But it has led to real kind of political concerns. If you take the case of Egypt, bread has always been a political issue there. They've had at least 5 major bread riots or crises in the country's history, most recently in 2017. They've managed to fix the price of official bread, but if you can't get official bread, you go to the private market, it's twice the price. It becomes a real issue. So for many countries, food prices are political, whether you like it or not. Not all of them have that kind of fiscal space to control them.
All right, Dr. Ted George, founder, Chief Narrative Officer, Cleos Advisory UK, thanks so much for joining us on the programme.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And a court in Moscow has fined Google's parent company, Alphabet Inc., for failing to remove contentious videos. The US tech giant has handed 2 fines totaling 11 million rubles for administrative violations. Now, the Tangsky District Court in Moscow said the company had distributed inaccurate data about Russian troop losses and civilian casualties in Ukraine. One of the videos was said to show a phone conversation between Russian soldiers and their relatives back home. The troops were said to be complaining of casualties in their ranks. Well, some foreign social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram, have been blocked in Russia. YouTube, however, remains available. Google faced action from Russia before. It was fined 7.2 billion rubles, that's about 70 million pounds, in December 2021. And this was for failure to delete content deemed illegal in Russia.